On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It was the first time a nuclear weapon had ever been used in warfare. The explosion killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more died in the weeks and months that followed, from burns, injuries, and radiation exposure. Today, Hiroshima is a thriving city of over 1 million people. People live, work, and raise families there. That fact sits uneasily against what most people understand about nuclear disasters, because Chernobyl, the site of a nuclear reactor accident in 1986, remains largely uninhabitable nearly 4 decades later. Both involved catastrophic nuclear events. But the outcomes could not be more different. Why? The answer lies as much in history as in physics. This is the story of how Hiroshima came back to life. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had been grinding on for years. Japan had shown no willingness to surrender, despite devastating conventional bombing campaigns that had already destroyed much of Tokyo and dozens of other Japanese cities. An Allied land invasion of the Japanese home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, was being planned, with military estimates projecting casualties in the hundreds of thousands on both sides. President Truman and Allied leadership concluded that the atomic bomb offered a way to force Japanese surrender without an invasion. Hiroshima was selected from a short list of potential targets after careful deliberation. It needed to be a city large enough that the bomb's effects would be undeniable, but one that had not already been heavily bombed, so that the damage from the atomic weapon could be clearly attributed and its psychological impact would be unambiguous. Hiroshima met both criteria. It was a major military and industrial hub, home to the headquarters of the Second Army and significant military infrastructure. And it had been largely spared from conventional bombing raids. It was also geographically compact, surrounded by hills that military planners believed would concentrate the blast. The bomb was called Little Boy. It was loaded aboard a B-29 Superfortress named the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, who had been specially selected and trained for the mission. The flight from the island of Tinian in the Pacific to Hiroshima took roughly 6 hours. Little Boy was a uranium bomb, a gun-type device in which a conventional explosive fired one piece of uranium into another to achieve critical mass. It weighed about 4,400 kilograms and contained approximately 64 kilograms of enriched uranium. At 8:15 in the morning on August 6th, the bomb was released from an altitude of around 9,400 meters. It fell for 44 seconds. Of the 64 kilograms of enriched uranium, only about 700 grams, roughly 1% of the total material, actually underwent fission and released nuclear energy. The rest was simply blown apart by the explosion before it could react. Despite this extraordinary inefficiency, that single kilogram of fission was enough to produce a blast equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of conventional explosive. The explosion produced a fireball reaching temperatures of several million degrees Celsius, and the blast wave flattened nearly everything within roughly 1.6 kilometers of the hypocenter, causing severe damage across a much wider radius. Within the blast zone, buildings vanished entirely, and the shadows of people were burned into stone steps and walls. The intense heat also ignited fires across the city that merged into a firestorm, while survivors in the outer zones suffered severe burns and blast injuries. Of the roughly 350,000 people in Hiroshima that morning, somewhere between 70,000 and 90,000 died immediately. In the days and weeks that followed, a second wave of death began. Acute radiation syndrome, triggered by the intense burst of radiation at the moment of detonation, killed thousands who had initially survived the blast itself. Over the following years and decades, elevated rates of leukemia and other cancers emerged in survivor populations, and the long-term health effects of the bomb continued to be studied and documented for the rest of the 20th century. Yet, despite this immense human toll, Hiroshima's soil and structures did not become a long-term radioactive wasteland, a fact explained by the physics of how the bomb was detonated. Nuclear weapons can be detonated in 4 ways, depending on altitude. A subsurface burst detonates underground or underwater, maximizing local fallout and ground contamination, while containing much of the blast effect. A surface burst detonates at or near ground level, maximizing crater formation and local fallout but limiting the blast radius. A low-altitude air burst detonates at a few hundred meters, balancing blast radius and local contamination. And a high-altitude air burst detonates at extreme altitude, producing a massive electromagnetic pulse with limited blast and fallout effects. Each produces a fundamentally different pattern of destruction and radioactive contamination. Little Boy was detonated as a low-altitude air burst, approximately 600 meters above the city. This choice was deliberate and consequential. At that altitude, the fireball never touched the ground. When a nuclear fireball touches the ground, it vaporizes soil, debris, and building material, pulling enormous quantities of radioactive particles into the mushroom cloud, which then fall back to Earth as highly contaminated fallout across a wide area. This is what creates long-lasting radioactive contamination. Because Little Boy detonated above the ground, the fireball drew in relatively little surface material. The radiation released at the moment of detonation was intense and deadly to those nearby, but it was a burst, gone within seconds, rather than an ongoing contamination source deposited into the soil. This is why Hiroshima recovered. The intense radiation released at detonation was devastating to people nearby, but did not deeply contaminate the ground itself. Radiation levels in Hiroshima dropped to near normal background levels within days to weeks of the bomb. The city was not soaked in long-lived radioactive isotopes the way a reactor accident contaminates its surroundings. By 1946, reconstruction had already begun. The soil was not poisoned, the water was not permanently contaminated. People could return and rebuild because the ground itself had not been turned into a long-term radiation source. Hiroshima today is a modern Japanese city with a population of around 1.2 million people. The area near the hypocenter is home to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park and Museum, built around the preserved skeleton of the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, which has stood as a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1996. Radiation levels across the city are equivalent to those in any other major city in the world. Survivors of the bomb and their descendants live throughout the city. The recovery was not only possible, it was, by the standards of what happened there, remarkably complete. Chernobyl is different in almost every relevant way. The 1986 disaster was not a weapon. It was a reactor meltdown in which the nuclear fuel itself exploded and burned, releasing enormous quantities of radioactive material directly into the environment over 10 days of open fire. The material that burned and scattered was not a brief burst of radiation, but tons of actual nuclear fuel and reactor components, long-lived isotopes including cesium, strontium, and plutonium physically deposited across the surrounding landscape. Those isotopes have half-lives of decades to thousands of years. They soaked into the soil, entered the water table, and spread across thousands of square kilometers of what is now Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl covers 2,600 square kilometers and remains restricted to this day, not because of the explosion itself, but because the contaminated material is still physically there, still radioactive, and still entering the food chain through soil and groundwater. The difference between Hiroshima and Chernobyl is not the scale of the initial event. It is what was left behind afterward. Click the video on your screen right now, and I'll explain another everyday mystery you've wondered about your whole life, but never thought to look up.